I see the US president has threatened legal action against the BBC for its editing of a speech she made in 2021. This fallout from the BBC's what they've called an error of judgment is just continuing. It is going to it's not going away. And I brought this last week. I was talking more about the trans issue, but there's more to it, of course. So this, you know now that the speech in 2021 on the day his supporters overran the Capitol. The British broadcaster has admitted it was an error of judgment. Really? An error of judgment? Not fraud? The president's lawyers say the BBC must retract its documentary by the 14th of November or face a lawsuit for no less than $1 billion. $1 billion. He's just said $1 billion or 1.7 billion in New Zealand. And the documentary was on BBC's flagship program called Panorama. And as you know now, they spliced together two separate excerpts from one of Trump's speeches, creating the impression that he was inciting the 6th of January 2021 riots, which the lawyer said was false and defamatory. The revelation about the speech and wider criticism of the BBC News has plunged the broadcaster into crisis, resulting in the resignation of its two bosses, Director General Tim Davie and Chief Executive of News Deborah Turnus, over the weekend. This is big stuff. The very tippy top have gone. Its chair, Summer Shah, is still there, but has apologised for the editing of the footage, accepting the way the BBC edited a speech gave the impression of a direct call of violence, right? But he rejects claims of systemic bias in the broadcaster's news reporting. He said there were cases of individual errors and there were issues that pointed to underlying problems, but the notion of systemic or institutional bias could not hold true. He went on to say, I know that BBC News DNA and culture is to be impartial, as it's to provide the best news we can and the most trustworthy news. Would it be fair to say that bridge is well and truly burnt down? I've worked in many a newsroom over the years, and, you turn to the editor-in-chief, you turn to the head of the newsroom, and predominantly what they pump out comes from them. If you put something forward that, if he's saying, there might be some underlying problems, there might be a few little individual errors, but as a whole, we are not biased. That is BS. You're one big organism in a newsroom. He ploughed on, saying the BBC is committed to restoring public trust and ensuring its journalism meets the highest standard of fairness. Clearly mistakes have been made in this case, and the Director General and Deborah Turnus have taken responsibility for their mistakes. Well, they haven't taken responsibility. They quit. They walked out. That to me is just taking the easy way out. That's not taking responsibility. That's not them standing up and saying, yeah, we got a problem here. Yeah, we have been infiltrated. We have been taken over by a very small group of ideological people that have infected the whole of the BBC. And, we have to work our butts off to try and, set the ship straight again. But could it ever be? Because the public's burned. But just quitting, probably getting a nice little payout to shut up and leave, that's not addressing the problem at all. Coward's way out. Now, another part of the scathing interno memo leaked to the Telegraph also criticises bosses for dismissing complaints by eminent academics that bias views on subjects such as slavery, colonialism, and even the Irish famine were being presented as fact. Now, there's a journalist called Suzanne Moore. She left The Guardian very famously after they told her she was not allowed to write about gender topics because it made a lot of the staff feel unsafe. I mean, I was going to say, you can't make this stuff up. But yeah, so she couldn't write about it because people found unsafe that she was writing about gender topics. Anyway, she has written a great piece about this. She writes that such accusations of a lack of balance or indeed a complete absence of debate on disputed issues, comes as little surprise to her. She has long watched as the BBC deliberately attempted to gaslight its audience on complex issues such as transgender rights. Gaslighting, of course, means the creation of a false narrative and the manipulation of someone else's perception of reality. On trans issues, by misinforming viewers or ignoring stories that did not fit its pro-trans agenda, this is exactly what the BBC has done. The leaked memo speaks of unintended editorial bias, but this is a very neutral way of describing what has been going on. Activists within the corporation ran the LGBT desk, which is used by all the BBC news programs. The small group of journalists was committed to a pro-trans agenda and keeping their perspectives off air. All things trans were to be celebrated as rainbow-strewn flags in the name of diversity. In fact, diversity of reporting was crushed. And no difficult issues were to be mentioned. Coming out as trans was repeatedly described as euphoric. And anyone who questioned this was portrayed as a fascist. As stories piled up about how women's rights were affected, how surgeons in America were worried about the links between gender medicine and cancer, about the irreversible harm of puberty blockers, the BBC continued only to hear the tales of those assigned male at birth, finding liberation after fathering children and donning an unsuitable rubber miniskirt. The voices of detransitioners and infertile and the inability to achieve an orgasm after surgery were never featured. The voices of women who contested the notion of gender identity itself, many of them lesbians and respected writers, were never heard. There were rumours of a BBC blacklist, but certainly even on a program like, they've got a program called Women's Hour, get this, you would hear much more from trans than any gender-critical feminist. Presenters were subservient to any man presenting as female. Serious issues were ignored in favour of continual fluff pieces about drag queens or about some actress becoming non-binary by getting a haircut. Hannah Barnes is a person who led the investigation into the gender identity clinic at the Tavistock Centre, no longer working for the BBC. A year later, documents leaked from the World Professional Association on Transgender Health, itself an activist organisation, revealed messages from doctors in which it was acknowledged that patients were sometimes too young to fully understand the effect of puberty blockers on their fertility. They were ignored. The Cass Review, an in-depth 4-year piece of research, showed that the risks of supporting puberty in children outweighed the benefits. Stopping puberty in children outweighed the benefits. Stories of nurses being forced to change alongside biological men. Barely covered by the BBC. Trans beating women in sports was reported without comment when everyone could see what was happening. Indeed, the English language itself is being twisted to confuse us. Many do not understand what transgender means and assumes that a trans woman has fully and surgically transitioned. This is mostly not the case. Headlines describe transgender women as being found guilty of rape, which adds to confusion. Male crimes are being attributed to women. Now, Suzanne finished her piece by saying, we will look back on all of this, the medical negligence, the distortion, the omission of facts, the suppression of those who tried to get to the truth, those permanently damaged by gender care, and surely feel ashamed. Gosh, I hope she's right. That at the centre of this misinformation and deceit is the once cherished BBC, because it was one of the oldest news organisations in Britain. Confirms what she long suspected, yet she says, I'm shocked by this institutional deception. And of course, this is not just a problem for all the likes of the BBC, but for all mainstream media. You know, despite all the evidence that they are losing public trust, we still continue to see media outlets soft on, you know, Hamas, soft on trans, hard on Trump. So it's just such a fascinating piece. And the BBC, I mean, gosh, you know, again, you say, well, it doesn't really affect us. We're in New Zealand. No, but it's infiltrated everywhere. We know that. And then the likes of the platform and people that question and speak out and bring light to stories, you know, we're called anti-trans activists, hard right, you know, and crazy and all the things that go with it. As I said, you know, I've been in many a newsroom over the years and I've seen it myself, and especially in the last year before I left the last, you know, big mainstream outlet, media outlet. And I will never forget the day after Kelly J. Keane was attacked and had to cancel her speech and then her tour because of protests. She basically fled New Zealand, you know, amid the counter protesters and the violence and all that happened. And that was the same day Marama Davidson was down there. Of course she was, the Greens. And she was filmed, remember, saying it's cis white males that are behind all the violence. And no one picked it up. No one. I mean, it went on social media. I remember the next day, no one talked about it. So-called talkback station. And when queried, journalists went, I didn't see that. Well, when was that? They knew, didn't want to cover it. And then we talked about it on our show. We were the only ones. And we had to literally sit down with our editor of the newsroom and say, we're going to cover this. And he said, no, you're not. Why? So because basically she's just blamed all white men for the violence in New Zealand. And you know, and that's not a big deal. No, it's not really a story, is it? So we pushed and we said, we're going to do it. Oh, well then don't do it for too long. We did it for 2 hours and we had to cut people off in the end. And that was just, you know, that was just one of the stories I'll always remember. And of course, you know, my story of all the rest going forward. So, you know, I hope what Suzanne did say, that we will look back on all of this now that, again, more and more lids are being lifted. You know, we're seeing behind the curtain. And this distortion and the omission of facts and the suppression of those that have tried to get to the truth, we will. They'll feel surely ashamed and it will change. Leah, the British public are turning away from mainstream media just like we are, the only people that are left watching old lefty boom as well. Possibly, you know, I get that, but you know, the BBC, there's such a big organisation that a lot of their, you know, their news is not just for Europe, it's for all of Europe. You know, they've got correspondents all around the world, but yeah, I know what you're saying. And it's terrestrial as well, so people have to still pay TV licenses and people just stop paying their TV license. That's what I would do. Leah, when I hear the phrase, I feel unsafe, I immediately respond with 2 words starting with F and O. That phrase is the biggest load of BS. The show today is brought to you by F and O and BS. The people saying it should be laughed out for their stupidity, says Simon. I know, for fear, right? I've had that used on me. I was supposed to do my rainbow training at my last establishment, and I was ready to go. I thought, all right, I'll do it. Let's see what all the fuss is about. I've been told I have to do it. And the morning I got in there, I got an email saying, no, it's cancelled. And I went into my manager's office. I said, where's my rainbow training? I was ready to go. I was seriously ready to go. But I was going to go with some questions. So I was going to, well, I didn't tell them that, but I was going to listen. Why not? Going to listen. And he went, no, They got a hold of me last night. They being the rainbow community people in the ticks and company. No, we feel unsafe. We feel unsafe. I'd never met any of these people. I didn't even know who I was really meeting. I had an email back and forth with some person who seemed quite pleasant. And we said, look forward to seeing you next week. And all of a sudden, between that email and smiley faces, I had become a danger. And I laughed out loud. And I think I did what you did, Simon. I said an F word followed by an O word while laughing. I said, you got to be F serious. He didn't see the funny side. I am very serious. HR appeared, like, poof, like demons do. Suddenly she's there. Oh, Leah, everyone's scared of you. What? I said, this has got to be. Am I on? Remember Candid Camera? Oh, yeah. So, yeah, I'm with you, Simon. And the reason they wanted to cancel it was to draw it out longer because they really didn't have a case. They wanted to make it even, make me look bad, make me feel supposedly worse than I was feeling. And that was why they did it. Because if they really wanted to enlighten me, they would have met with me. They would have told me why. It's so amazing. This company's got a rainbow tick and we all bow down to the LGBTQ AI plus people. But they didn't. They hid and said, no, I feel danger. I feel like I'm scared. I'm unsafe. It is. It's a whole pile of steaming poo.